Welcome, and thanks for listening to Cherry Bekaert's Government and Public Sector podcast series. In each episode, we hear from the best in the business on the latest challenges, trends, and opportunities affecting the government and public sector. I'm Christian Fjellgraff, leader of Cherry Bekaert's Government and Public Sector industry team. I hope you enjoy, and thank you for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to the True Cost of Your Grant. The more you know, the more you win. Episode 4 of our Grants Management podcast series. This episode will focus on indirect costs related to grants and why it is so very important to capture those costs to help support your organization with personnel and overhead costs related to grant projects. I'm Kimberly Konczack, a manager here at Cherry Bekaert, and I have been working with our fantastic grants management team for the last year here at Cherry Bekaert, and prior to that was converted to an official grant nerd a few years ago and love working with our government and public sector clients. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Kat to introduce herself.
I'm so happy you're a grant nerd now. Welcome over to our team on the dark side.
Easily converted to the dark side.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. My name's Kat Kizior. I work with the grants management team here at Cherry Bekaert. I am a certified grants management specialist, and I have over 20 years in grants and accounting experience. So I do want to let you guys know, before we get into the direct costs, we introduce our very special guest. If you have not watched episode 2, which is direct cost, justify your grant expenditures, I suggest you listen to that podcast right after this or before. It ties directly to the topic we're discussing today, and these two podcasts together will give you a total picture of costs related to grants. So Kimberly?
So Kat, you alluded to a very special guest. So the cat's out of the bag. And today, our special guest, whom I have such a pleasure to introduce, is Nikky Lettini. She is our resident expert here at Cherry Bekaert. Nikky, please tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Kim. Hi, everyone. I'm Nikky Lettini. I'm the director here over at Cherry Bekaert for Indirect Cost Services. I have been doing nothing but cost allocation, indirect costs, cost recovery on grants related to indirect costs for the last 23 years, so my entire career. So just like being a grant nerd, I'm an indirect cost nerd. I love this stuff. I'm the weirdest one I know of the bunch. Most people look at me like, I don't know what's wrong with you and why you think this is so great. But for me, it is such an incredible and important aspect of doing business that oftentimes gets forgotten or doesn't get looked at. And there are so many opportunities to leverage indirect costs to benefit your organization and bring additional dollars in, but as well as just understanding for sustainability purposes, what is it costing you to do these services? So I'm excited to be here today. Thank you guys for having me, and look forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Nikky. So, Kat, let me start with a question for you. It seems appropriate to start with this one at the very basic level. What is indirect cost?
Yes, I can answer that one. So there are two types of costs that are generally related to a grant. So there's first a direct cost, and that's a cost that can specifically be identified with a particular project or program or an activity and can be directly assigned to such activities easy and with a high degree of accuracy. So this is a cost that when you incur this cost, it is a benefit to your grant and your grant only. Indirect costs are a little more complicated. These costs are not easily identified with a specific project or an organizational activity, but is incurred as a joint benefit for other projects and other activities not specifically related to the grant. Indirect costs are considered necessary to the operation of the organization and the performance of that project. Some examples of indirect costs related to grants may be like maintaining facilities or depreciation or administrative salaries. These kind of things, if you think about that, it can be difficult to split out a particular cost for a particular type of project. They could all be wrapped together. So before we jump into actually getting Nikky online and giving us all the good details and understanding indirect costs, I do want to say that even as a certified grant management specialist, I do not even have a total grasp on indirect costs and all the ins and outs of determining a rate or requesting like an indirect cost rate. To me, probably to many of you folks that are listening as well, the indirect cost process is tricky and complicated. So let me tell you, when I say Nikki has a special set of skills, she has a special set of skills that she has honed for 20 some years, and she is truly an expert on this topic. So again, thank you, Nikki, for coming to this podcast to talk about this indirect cost, because I definitely cannot do it justice.
That is so true, Kat. I echo your same sentiments on that one. So Nikki, just to lay the groundwork a bit to understanding indirect costs, and why don't we talk some terminology first? I am somewhat familiar with the alphabet soup involved when it comes to it, but would love to hear from you some of the common terms that are used when you're discussing indirect costs.
Sure. So oftentimes indirect cost, one of the reasons why it's hard to understand or identify is people don't even know the terminologies, the definitions, all of that. So we talk about cost allocation plans and indirect cost rates, and oftentimes they're talked about synonymously. However, they are different. So cost allocation plans are really that 30,000-foot view of your organization. We identify those centralized indirect costs such as finance, HR, facilities, those areas where their responsibility is really to truly support the entire organization. So not just a grant, not just a project, but everybody. So that cost allocation plan breaks down those centralized services into functions of service like payroll, HR, accounts payable, general accounting, those more smaller granule functions of service. It identifies allocation bases and spreads it out to all of the departments, funds, programs, projects, all of those services within the agency. And what the result of that is the dollar amount of indirect cost on an annual basis. So that's step one. And then we have indirect cost rates, which is what I think most people think about when they're talking about it. And what that is this cost allocation plan rolls into the indirect cost rate as part of the indirect cost pool. So that's more your agency-wide indirect. And then in addition to that, we layer on the levels of the more departmental indirect costs, such as directors or supervisors overseeing a handful of projects or programs or grants. And then the result of that gives us a rate that we can apply to every dollar of spend. So if we're looking at a grant program and we have $100,000 of spend, then let's say our rate's 30%, we're going to have $30,000 of indirect cost spend to support that 100,000. So those rates versus the cost allocation plan, it's really the cost allocation plan is that step one. But this can also be used for many things more than grants. So that's something to keep in mind as well, because the cost allocation plan determines all of the costs across the board, not just the grants. Then you have the opportunity to use that for other things like user fees and types of things. But those are kind of the difference but we're going to focus on the indirect cost rates as they pertain to grants.
Hey, Nikki, I was just thinking as a follow-up. So you and I do a lot of grant training, and we travel around and do presentations and teach folks about grants management. And one of the things that we hear all the time from our grant peers is we want to spend all of our grant funding on the project. We are not interested on spending any funding on administrative costs. So how do you explain to people that the importance of using indirect costs when they can to recover something like administrative costs?
Yeah, that's a great comment. We hear that all the time. And so I think it's about taking a step back and changing the perspective of how indirect costs relates to grants. And so the idea behind it is everyone assumes that if they spend money on indirect costs, then it's not going to the program. But what I could say is indirect cost does not exist if it does not have direct cost to support. And in turn, direct costs cannot function without the use of indirect costs. So what I mean by that is if we're looking at a grant program, there are people that are working directly on that grant. It's the direct cost spend. I would say that anyone who's working and they work for an agency, they're going to want a paycheck. And so they're going to want to be paid for those services, which in turn are the direct cost of this grant. So or we need to have a computer to do our job. I mean, we all can definitely attest to the fact that everything goes south if we can't even do our email or use our computer to look up things. So to me, if we look at it from the perspective of we don't want it to go to the grant, I don't think we can argue that those costs are absolutely critical to performing the services to execute on this grant. So then from there, it's how do we look at it from a perspective of the fact that we are an agency as a whole. We are not just responsible for these couple grants. So as a grants manager, it's typical to be very protective of your grant funds but what we really need to realize is that we are one of many other areas, many other grant programs, many other services that an agency is performing. And so it's a zero-sum game. And so the idea is that there are indirect costs that have to be spread across the board. And if you do not collect indirect costs associated with a specific grant, that is a subsidy. And that subsidy has to come from somewhere else. So it's being taken away from another program or service that's being performed. So that is really important to keep in mind, because we can think of it from our own little box and our own little circle of the grants that we support. But in reality, it's the whole organization that is left to pick up the pieces of the subsidy that is incurring. So whether or not we collect it, you're subsidizing it. So then how does the agency decide moving forward what the best use of funds are and where we get those funds from?
So those of you out there who think indirect costs are not important or they're not relevant, or you have problems with your leadership to get them to understand how important it is to actually collect on indirect costs off of your grant, when you have a chance, go back and listen to that one more time and take that with you. Take it with you and use that to help others understand why it's important.
Well, and I think too, just to kind of add to its importance and why you can kind of take advantage of it, is because and Nikki, I'll defer to you to expand, but for one thing, not subsidizing with perhaps general fund dollars to run a grant program, but also for match requirements. Mm-hmm. So yeah, if you want to talk a little bit about the match component, Nikki, I think that is definitely worth mentioning.
Sure. So with the uniform guidance, the 2 CFR Part 200, when it came out back in 2014-15, they added a component related to the match requirement. So many agencies will pass up opportunities for grants because they don't have the cash to set aside for the match. But now, given the guidelines, if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate, you are able to use that as your match. So what that means is, let's say you have a 25% match component or responsibility for a grant, and your indirect cost rate is 30%, then you are fully covered. When you apply for that grant, you identify the fact that you're going to use your negotiated indirect cost rate as your match component. You have to set no dollars aside, and you get to then obtain that grant and use that as your match. And it's the federal government's acknowledgement that indirect cost does exist. The idea is you really are supporting it, you really are subsidizing it. So that is your contribution to the grant. So that is something that's really important. It might open the door, an opportunity for accessing more dollars and more grants for your organization.
Thanks, Nikki. So we've talked about how important it is. So let's get to logistics. Can anyone get an indirect cost rate? And if they do go get a negotiated indirect cost rate, how long does that take?
Yeah, great question. The answer is yes, anyone can get an indirect cost rate, and I highly recommend it. Even if you don't use it in every case across the board, as an organization, we want to be fiscally responsible, and understanding what those costs are or what the subsidy that you are giving is really critical to moving forward in sustainability. But basically, the idea is for a governmental agency, if you're receiving more than $35 million in direct federal funding, then if you want to get an indirect cost rate, you must get it negotiated. And so you negotiate that with your cognizant agency or the agency where you receive the largest amount of funding. If you're less than $35 million, then you can perform the necessary calculation, add all the supplemental information as if you were going to submit for negotiation, but then you keep it on your shelf. And then understanding that if there's any funder that requests your negotiated indirect cost rate, you provide this to them, your calculation, your indirect cost rate following the guidelines, and they must accept that rate or they themselves are required to negotiate. They cannot tell you you can't use it because it hasn't been formally negotiated. The same applies on the nonprofit side, but the dollar amount is 10 million. So if you receive more than 10 million, you negotiate. Less than 10 million, you still calculate it, you still do the same process, you just leave on the shelf. So understanding that is really critical because a lot of funders don't really understand that. And they will say, oh, well, you can't, if you haven't negotiated it formally, we will not accept this rate. And that is absolutely not allowable. And I have a letter, I've worked with the White House, I have a letter directly from them stating that. So if anyone comes up who's listening to this podcast and comes against that little hurdle, reach out to Cherry Bekaert. We can definitely help you with that and getting that pushed through, because that is the intention of the uniform guidance. And I have a letter specifically stating that from the White House. Oh, and
That's
how long
great.
should it take? So if you have to formally negotiate, that's the problem sometimes. We don't know exactly long. It depends on the backlog of the federal agency, but I would say anywhere from 3 to 6 months. It might take to get negotiated. Now, that doesn't mean you're working on it for 3 to 6 months. It means it's sitting in a queue. So once it's sitting in that queue, it's when it's assigned to an auditor or a negotiator, as I would say it's like 1 to 2 weeks at that point in time where they're just spot checking. They are only there to figure out, have you been in compliance with the uniform guidance? Did you unallow costs that are unallowable, include the correct indirect cost rate? They are not there to tell you your rate is too high or we won't approve it because it's too high. They must follow the audited financials, and they do that. If you do not have to negotiate because you are underneath that threshold, you can probably from start to finish have a indirect cost rate finalized with 8 to 12 weeks, I would say.
Thanks, Nikki. So you mentioned government agencies, nonprofits, but what about subrecipients of grant funding? Do they get indirect cost rates?
Absolutely. So subrecipients definitely are an organization. They should have an indirect cost rate. There are some limitations in the grant, so you always have to look at what is the specific statutory information that's related to a specific grant. And so there might be some limitations, but they should absolutely have an indirect cost rate and be able to apply that and use that as leverage on the grants that they're getting from the funders for the pass-through agencies.
That makes sense. Yeah. Kat, why don't you tell us a little bit about the guidance for indirect costs and where we might find that?
So as Nikki mentioned, Uniform Guidance 2 CFR 200.414 provides guidance for indirect costs. Uniform Guidance is where all rules and regulations live for grants. And this is your guide to help you go in and follow and stay compliant with all those rules and regulations. So 2 CFR 200.414 for indirect costs. Always check your state and local statutes as well. When anything to deal with grants, and in this case as well, they may have specific requirements, and the grantor will also have in their terms and conditions whether you can or cannot take indirect costs or be reimbursed for indirect costs, and sometimes they have caps. So always read your terms and conditions, and then if you have the ability to be reimbursed for indirect costs, act on that. And you can also look at the grantor's website and online as well to find information about indirect cost rates.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, with that, I will conclude our podcast with a huge thank you to Kat and Nikki for joining. If you are interested in reaching out to any one of us, please feel free to do so. Our email addresses are as follows. Nikki can be reached at Nikky, Nikky, Lettini, Lettini, @cbh.com. Kat can be reached at Kat, Kizior, Kizior, @cbh.com. And I can be reached at Kimberly, Kimberly, Konczack, Konczak, @cbh.com. I mentioned alphabet soup earlier, so there you go. Our next podcast is on grants and workflow automation, where we will discuss how grant management software can improve grant tracking and reporting. Thank you to our audience for listening in today, and remember to subscribe to the series at www.cbh.com/Cherry-Bekaert-podcasts. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was Christian again. I hope you enjoyed this episode and look forward to our next one. Don't forget to subscribe.